It was a chilly morning in the city. The streets were crowded with people rushing to their destinations. Among the hustle and bustle, there was a man no one seemed to notice. A homeless black man sitting on the cold concrete sidewalk, his tattered clothes barely protecting him from the harsh winds. His face, weathered by time and struggle, was hidden behind a scruffy beard. His eyes, though tired, held a deep sorrow, as if they had seen more pain than anyone should ever have to bear. The man was hunched over, his knees pulled up to his chest, his arms wrapped around them as if trying to hold himself together. His clothes were old and stained, the fabric torn at the edges, and his shoes were nothing more than worn-out pieces of leather that barely resembled footwear. A thin blanket lay across his lap, a poor attempt at shielding him from the cold. His hands were rough and cracked, likely from years of living on the streets, yet they were steady as they gripped a small, dented coffee cup, the only thing he had left to collect spare change. He sat there for hours, barely moving, watching the world go by. People passed him without a second glance. Some looked at him with disgust. Some pretended he wasn't even there, while others would cross the street to avoid getting too close. Occasionally someone would toss a coin into his cup, their faces showing either indifference or pity. But it was clear no one really cared about him. There were those who would even laugh at him. A group of teenagers walked by, pointing and mocking him with cruel words. One of them shouted, "Get a job, loser," and they all burst into laughter, not caring that their words pierced deeper than any blade could. The homeless man's face remained still, almost frozen in his despair. He didn't react to the insults or the mockery. He had learned long ago that fighting back didn't change anything. His silent dignity became his only shield. But deep down there was a fire, a lingering anger, a feeling of being utterly forgotten by society, of having been thrown away like a piece of trash. Yet there was a part of him that refused to give up, to let the world defeat him completely. As the day wore on, the streetlights began to flicker on, casting long shadows. People continued their routines, and the homeless man remained in his place, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence of his life. Suddenly, the scene shifts to a flashback, the man's life before the streets. We see him as a younger man wearing a military uniform. The pride on his face is unmistakable. He's standing tall, holding a medal in his hand, a symbol of his bravery and service to his country. He is surrounded by fellow soldiers, his comrades, and the camaraderie is evident in their smiles and laughter. They are a family, united by a common cause, a cause that brought them through tough times together. He had been a decorated soldier, recognized for his courage in battle. He had given everything for his country, fought in wars, and saved lives. His family was proud of him, and his community respected him. But as time passed, things began to change. The war took its toll on him. The nightmares started, flashbacks, moments when he could still hear the sounds of explosions and gunfire, feel the weight of the pain and loss. The once proud soldier began to crumble under the weight of the emotional scars, unable to cope with the trauma of war. When he returned home, there was no support waiting for him. The world he had fought for had moved on, and he was left behind. His family couldn't understand what he was going through, and his friends, who once called him a hero, now looked at him with confusion. PTSD consumed him, and without a job or any sense of purpose, he became lost. His savings quickly ran out, and one mistake after another led to him losing his home. And so he was left wandering the streets with nothing but his memories and that single military medal in his pocket. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance as a police cruiser rolled into view. The racist police officer behind the wheel was Officer Gregory Reynolds. He was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had never smiled a day in its life. He wore his uniform like a badge of superiority, the creases sharp and the badge glinting in the sunlight. His eyes, however, were the most unsettling feature. There was a coldness in them, a certain disdain for people like the homeless man sitting on the curb. As Reynolds drove by, his gaze fell on the homeless man. The officer's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. He slammed on the brakes, causing the tires to screech loudly against the asphalt. Without a moment's hesitation, he threw the car in park and stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. The homeless man, still sitting quietly, didn't even flinch as the officer approached. He could sense the officer's contempt before he even said a word. Reynolds eyed him up and down, his eyes lingering on the man's tattered clothes, the worn-out shoes, and the scruffy beard. To Reynolds, he was just another lazy bum with no purpose. "Hey," the officer barked, his voice rough and filled with irritation. "What the hell are you doing here? Don't you have a job to go to, or are you just another worthless piece of garbage taking up space?" The homeless man remained silent, his eyes avoiding the officer's glare. He had been on the streets long enough to know when arguing would only make things worse. He wasn't going to give the officer the satisfaction of a reaction. "Answer me," Reynolds shouted again, stepping closer, looming over the man like a predator about to strike. His hand hovered over his baton, as if ready to use it at any moment. "You think this is your place? You're nothing but a lazy, good-for-nothing fool. Pathetic." The officer's voice was dripping with disgust as he continued to insult the man. But the homeless man remained as still and calm as before, his head slightly lowered, his expression unreadable. Reynolds' frustration began to build. He didn't like being ignored. He hated being disrespected, especially by someone he felt was beneath him. He took a few steps back and shook his head, almost as if laughing at the homeless man's refusal to speak. "You think you're too good to talk to me? You're not better than anyone, you piece of trash." Reynolds sneered, his words sharp and cutting. The homeless man didn't even meet his eyes. He had heard it all before. Racial slurs, mockery, and the same insults over and over. It was like the world had written him off, as if he didn't matter. But he wasn't going to fight back. There was nothing to prove. Remaining silent was his only form of defense. Seeing the homeless man's quiet defiance only enraged Reynolds further. He couldn't stand it. He enjoyed humiliating others, especially those he thought were weaker. With a sudden sharp motion, Reynolds reached for the homeless man's arm, yanking him to his feet. "That's it," Reynolds said, his grip tightening on the man's arm as he pulled out his handcuffs. "I'm done with you. You're coming with me." The homeless man's body tensed for a moment, but he didn't resist. The officer forced the handcuffs around his wrists almost with excessive force, enjoying the power he held over the man. It was a small victory for Reynolds, one he had won by demeaning a man who had nothing left to lose. Reynolds pushed the homeless man toward the police car, still muttering insults under his breath. "You think you're tough, huh? You're just a burden on this society. Always will be." The homeless man didn't speak. He simply walked, his shoulders slumped, his head lowered, as the officer continued to drag him along. The police car door slammed shut with a loud bang as Officer Reynolds shoved the homeless man into the back seat. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into the man's wrists as he sat there, silently staring out the window. The car's interior was sterile, uncomfortable, and smelled of old leather and cigarette smoke. But none of it mattered to the homeless man. He had seen much worse. Reynolds slammed the car door and strode around to the driver's side. He opened the door and slid into his seat, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and disdain. As he started the engine, he couldn't help but continue his tirade. "You're pathetic," he muttered under his breath, as if the homeless man couldn't hear him. "A grown man living on the streets like some animal. No job, no family, no future. Just a waste of space." The officer's words were venomous, meant to humiliate, to degrade. He believed that every homeless person was a failure, incapable of achieving anything in life. In his mind, the man's tattered clothes and quiet demeanor were proof enough that he was worthless. Reynolds glanced in the rearview mirror, eyes narrowing at the homeless man's calmness. "What's the matter? No defense? No, I'm not lazy speech?" The officer laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Guess you've just accepted your fate, huh? Just a no-good loser who couldn't hack it in the real world. Bet you've never done anything worth remembering in your life." The homeless man didn't respond. His face was a mask of stillness, his eyes distant, as if his mind was far away from the officer's angry words. He didn't flinch, didn't show any signs of being affected. The officer's insults were nothing new to him. His silence, however, seemed to infuriate Reynolds even more. "I bet you've been on the streets for years, huh? You probably don't even remember what it feels like to have a roof over your head. Or to have a purpose in life," Reynolds sneered. "You're just another statistic. A failure in every sense of the word." The homeless man sat there, his gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. His posture remained straight, his body not slumped as one might expect. Despite the officer's cruelty, there was something undeniably dignified in the man's quiet resistance. It was clear that his silence was his strength. The officer was hoping for a reaction, something that would justify his cruelty, but the man wouldn't give him that satisfaction. The car passed by a group of people on the sidewalk, and as usual, the officer couldn't resist showing off his so-called authority. He leaned out of the window, waving at the group, flashing his badge with a mocking smile. "You see this guy?" Reynolds shouted, pointing back at the homeless man. "You all want him in your neighborhood? He's good for nothing. Just another lazy bum. Always asking for handouts, never doing a thing for himself." The people on the sidewalk exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody responded. They knew better than to get involved. But for Reynolds, this was just another opportunity to assert his power to put someone in their place. The homeless man's calmness only made him feel more entitled to this cruel behavior. As the car pulled up to the police station, Reynolds couldn't stop himself from adding one more insult. "You don't belong here, but guess what? You're going to get the treatment you deserve," he spat, opening the door and getting out. The doors of the police station swung open as Officer Reynolds marched in with the homeless man trailing behind him, still silent, still calm. The other officers at the station barely even noticed them at first, but as soon as they saw the homeless man's worn clothes and disheveled appearance, a few of them started chuckling. "What's this?" Officer Daniels, a younger cop with a constant smirk on his face, said as he glanced up. "A street rat. Did he steal someone's lunch or just fail at life?" Another officer, Sergeant Foster, snickered. "Guess he forgot how to make a living, huh? Maybe he should go get a job instead of just sitting around all day." The homeless man remained stoic, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his expression unchanged. The officer's words, while meant to belittle him, didn't even seem to register in his mind. Reynolds, seeing the man's unwavering composure, felt a mix of frustration and anger. He had expected the homeless man to react, to fight back, to beg for mercy, to give in. But this man had no response, and that unsettled him more than anything else. So, he continued to stoke the flames of the man's supposed inferiority. "Hey, look at him, guys. Think he's too good to speak to us?" Reynolds said loudly, throwing his arm around the homeless man's shoulders in a show of false camaraderie. "He won't even talk back, like he's some kind of saint." The other officers laughed, enjoying the man's discomfort, but there was no discomfort on the homeless man's face. There was only a deep sadness at how little they understood, how little they cared. As Reynolds led him into the holding area, the mockery continued. "Don't worry, pal," Daniels called out. "We've got plenty of room for you in the jailhouse. You'll fit right in with the rest of the losers." The homeless man didn't respond. He just walked forward, the sounds of their laughter echoing in his ears. But inside, something stirred. It wasn't anger. It wasn't bitterness. It was resignation. He had been here before, in places just like this. It had never mattered. The police station was a typical bustling hub of activity, with officers coming and going, chatting amongst themselves, and handling their usual tasks. But Officer Reynolds was focused entirely on the homeless man who sat slumped on a bench in the corner, handcuffed and silent. The man's demeanor had only intensified Reynolds' irritation. His calmness was like a challenge that Reynolds wasn't sure he could fully face. The process of booking the man was routine, checking his personal details, searching him for any weapons or contraband. Reynolds was tired, almost bored, and treated the homeless man as nothing more than a troublemaker. His gloved hands rummaged through the man's torn pockets, moving through the frayed edges of his jacket and pants, hoping to find something useful to charge him with. But all he found were small, insignificant items, crumpled receipts, a half-empty pack of cigarettes, a few coins. It was just more proof, in his mind, that the man had nothing going for him. But then, something caught his eye. Reynolds' fingers brushed against a small object, something out of place. He pulled it out and immediately froze. A military medal glinting in the dim light, its surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent glow of the room. The metal was polished, though slightly worn from years of use. There were ribbons attached to it, the fabric showing signs of age, but still colorful and vibrant. Reynolds' gaze dropped to the medal in his hand. For a moment he just stared at it, puzzled. His mind raced. Why would a homeless man have something like this? He turned to the man, who still hadn't reacted, his expression unreadable. Reynolds stepped closer, holding the medal out in front of him. "What's this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Some fake medal you picked up off the street. Stolen from someone else, maybe?" The homeless man finally looked up, his eyes meeting the officers. For the first time since their encounter, there was a hint of something in the man's gaze, not pride, but a quiet recognition, as though the medal held a weight far beyond the officer's comprehension. "It's a war hero's medal," the homeless man replied softly. His voice was steady, not defensive, just matter-of-fact. "I earn it?" Reynolds' eyebrows furrowed. "A war hero's medal?" The officer snorted. "Yeah, right. And I'm a Nobel Prize winner. Come on, tell me the truth." The man didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just nodded slightly, as though he had come to terms with how unbelievable his own story must sound. "I served in the military. In the war. I did things you can't understand." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Reynolds didn't know how to react. This was far from the story he had built in his mind about the homeless man. He had assumed the man was just a lazy failure, someone who had never contributed anything of value. But now, standing there with the medal in his hand, Reynolds felt a flicker of doubt. "A decorated war hero," Reynolds muttered, almost to himself as he turned the medal over in his hands. The man's words seemed to echo in his mind. Could it be true? The officer's gaze flicked back to the homeless man. There was something in his eyes now, a quiet strength, a depth that hadn't been there before. The officer wasn't sure what to make of it. "You expect me to believe that?" Reynolds scoffed, shaking his head. But even as the words left his mouth, something inside him wasn't so sure. Something didn't add up. The man wasn't acting like someone who was just trying to get by. There was a calmness to him that suggested there was more beneath the surface, something bigger than the officer had initially assumed. Reynolds put the medal down on the desk in front of the man, his fingers hovering over it. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a piece of cheap trinket. The officer's mind flickered to the stories he had heard from other soldiers, those who returned from war scarred, changed. Maybe this man wasn't just a lazy bum. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to him. But the doubt was quickly clouded by Reynolds' pride. What was he supposed to believe? This man had been living on the streets for who knows how long, a forgotten nobody. And yet, here he was, claiming to be a war hero. It didn't make sense. "You're telling me you were in the war?" Reynolds asked, his voice lowering as if he couldn't quite bring himself to believe it. "Then why are you on the streets? Where's your life gone?" The homeless man didn't respond immediately. He looked at the medal for a moment, and then his gaze shifted to Reynolds, who stood over him, waiting for an answer. "I lost it," the man said quietly. "I lost everything when I came back. The war never ends for people like me." Reynolds stood there, the weight of the man's words settling in. For a brief moment, the officer felt a shift in his perspective. This wasn't just some failure on the streets. This was a man who had sacrificed for his country, who had fought in wars that Reynolds couldn't even begin to imagine. The thought lingered in the back of his mind, but Reynolds wasn't ready to admit that yet. He wasn't ready to let go of the idea that the man in front of him was just another person to look down on. With a quick motion, he grabbed the medal and tucked it into his uniform pocket. "I'll take care of this. You just stay quiet," Reynolds said, his voice still harsh, still laced with a lack of belief. He turned away from the homeless man and headed toward his desk, trying to shake off the unease that had started to creep in. The room fell silent as Officer Reynolds stood over the homeless man, his back turned to him as he stared out the window of the police station. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder now, almost deafening. The medal was still in his pocket, but its presence weighed heavier than it had moments ago. The homeless man sat quietly, his handcuffed wrists resting on his knees. His tired eyes stared down at the floor, his face blank but his mind clearly lost in the past. For the first time, it seemed like the man was about to speak, not with anger or frustration, but with a deep pain that had built up over years of neglect. Reynolds hesitated. For a brief moment he wondered if he should just walk away. But something inside of him made him stay. He needed to hear it, whatever this man had to say. The homeless man cleared his throat, his voice raspy but strong enough to fill the silence. "You want to know who I really am?" he asked, his tone calm yet weary. "Well, I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always nothing." The officer turned, looking at the man, unsure of what to expect. "I was a soldier," the homeless man continued, his eyes distant as if he were speaking not to Reynolds, but to the ghosts of his past. "I fought for this country. I put my life on the line for people I didn't even know. I thought I was doing the right thing, thought I was serving a higher purpose." He paused for a moment, his eyes clouding with memories. "I served in a foreign war, far from home. We were sent to do things, to fight in places most people couldn't even point to on a map. It was hard, brutal. People died. Good men, men who never made it back." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably as he listened, but the homeless man didn't stop. "I was a part of those battles, a part of the team that fought. I was decorated for my service. I didn't just survive, I was recognized for my bravery. I wore that medal with pride. I thought I was proud to have served my country." He looked down at his hands, which had once held weapons of war, but now were empty and shaking. "But when I came home, I didn't get a parade. I didn't get the respect I thought I deserved. I came back to nothing. No support, no resources, just an empty country that didn't care about me anymore." Reynolds felt an uncomfortable tug in his chest as he listened to the man's words, but the homeless man's story was far from over. "They said they'd help. They promised me healthcare, therapy, a place to stay, but none of it came. I needed help for the PTSD, for the things I saw, the things I did. I needed help to rebuild, but all I got was ignored. They sent me off to a clinic, told me I was fine. But I wasn't fine." He shook his head, his voice thick with the weight of his lost years. "I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat without remembering. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like I was back there, hearing the screams, the gunfire. And every day I went out there, trying to find a job, trying to pretend like I was okay, but no one wanted to hire me. I wasn't who I was anymore. I was just a broken man. The officer's stomach churned. He felt a tightening in his chest, like something was pressing down on him. The man's story wasn't just a tale of losing everything. It was a testament to betrayal, to a system that had taken a young man and thrown him away the moment he was no longer of use. I lost my family, the homeless man whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't protect them like I thought I could. I couldn't even protect myself. They didn't understand. They left. His gaze lifted slowly, locking eyes with Reynolds for the first time, and there was no anger, no accusation in those eyes, just tiredness and resignation. I lost everything. My job, my house, my dignity. I was just a ghost. Forgotten. But I never stopped being a soldier. I never stopped serving. Reynolds stood frozen, his mind spinning as the weight of the man's words sank in. He had treated this person like trash, like a nuisance. He had arrested him without even a second thought, without ever once considering the man's past, the fact that he was a war hero. A hero who had sacrificed his life for a country that had left him to rot on the streets. The officer's throat went dry, and his heart started to race. The guilt hit him like a hammer to the chest. He had made assumptions, harsh, unfair assumptions, and treated this man like he was nothing. But now, standing in the stark, fluorescent light of the police station, Reynolds realized just how wrong he had been. The homeless man wasn't just a drifter or a nobody. He was a hero. And Reynolds had just treated him like dirt. The officer took a step back, his mind in turmoil. He couldn't meet the man's eyes anymore. He couldn't even face him after everything he had said, everything he had done. I didn't know," Reynolds muttered, his voice barely a whisper. It was all he could manage, but it felt hollow, an apology that would never be enough. The homeless man didn't respond, just sitting there staring ahead. He had no reason to answer. He had told his story, the one that had been buried for so long. Now it was up to the officer to decide what to do with it. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow on the small, cold room. Officer Reynolds stood against the wall, his arms crossed, eyes staring down at the floor. He had been pacing, but now he had stopped, frozen in place by the weight of what he had just learned. He couldn't shake the image of the homeless man, a man who had served his country, fought in wars, and been hailed a hero, yet who had been reduced to nothing more than a nuisance in Reynolds' eyes. The shame that gnawed at him now was unbearable. He had thought the man was just another lazy individual, someone who deserved to be ignored, but now, with every passing moment, the guilt overwhelmed him. Reynolds couldn't stop replaying the man's words in his mind. "I lost everything." Those words echoed, and with them came the realization that the man hadn't been given a chance to heal, to rebuild, to be seen as the person he once was. He had been left to fend for himself, ignored by the very system he had fought for. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the images of the man's eyes, the deep sadness, the stoic dignity. Every word the homeless man had spoken was now like a sharp jab to Reynolds' conscience, each one breaking down the walls of racism and prejudice that he had built up over the years. For the first time, Reynolds truly saw the man sitting in front of him, not as a criminal, not as someone beneath him, but as a human being, someone who had faced unimaginable struggles. He was ashamed of the way he had treated him, of the way he had seen him only through the lens of his own biases. But in that moment, something shifted inside Reynolds. The anger, the prejudice, the judgment, it all started to melt away, leaving behind the painful truth that he had been wrong. He had let his assumptions blind him to the truth. The homeless man, still handcuffed and sitting in the same position, remained as calm as he had throughout the entire ordeal. His silence wasn't one of submission. It was the silence that spoke volumes of strength, of dignity, of a man who had been broken by the world, but still stood tall in the face of it. Finally, the officer broke the silence. His voice, rough and unsure, came out quietly, almost like a whisper. "I was wrong. Everything I thought about you, I was wrong." The homeless man didn't say anything, just looked up slowly, his face still unreadable. But his eyes, there was something in them that made Reynolds feel like he was standing in the presence of someone who had seen it all, someone who had been through more than Reynolds could ever imagine. Reynolds took a deep breath, his chest tightening as the weight of his guilt pressed down on him. He couldn't undo the hurt he had caused, but he knew he had to try. "I want to help you," he said, his voice wavering with sincerity. "I don't know how, but I want to make this right. You need help, medical care, a place to stay. I can get you that if you want." The homeless man shook his head slowly. "Help won't fix everything," he said quietly. "But it's a start." There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just a calm understanding that the world had failed him long ago and that no amount of help could undo the damage. But he appreciated the gesture, the fact that Reynolds had finally recognized his humanity. Reynolds nodded, though it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He wasn't sure where to start, or how to help a man who had already lost so much. But he had to try. "I'll make sure you get the medical care you need," Reynolds said, his voice firmer now. "I'll make sure you have a place to stay, somewhere safe. You don't deserve to be out on the streets. I can't undo the past, but I can help make the future better. You deserve that much." The homeless man didn't respond right away, but there was a small shift in his expression. A brief flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe just acknowledgement. He didn't need to say anything. His silence spoke volumes. It was a quiet recognition that the officer, once a man driven by his own prejudices, had finally made a step toward change. For a long moment neither spoke. They just sat there, each lost in their own thoughts. The officer knew he had no right to ask for forgiveness, but he couldn't help but feel that, in this moment, he was trying to redeem himself. Reynolds was ashamed of the way he had treated the homeless man, but he was determined to make things right, to help in whatever way he could. It was a small step, but it was a step that could change everything for both of them. The police station was eerily quiet now. Officer Reynolds sat at his desk, staring down at his hands, the weight of everything that had happened pressing heavily on his chest. He had offered the homeless man a lifeline, a chance to escape the life that had been thrust upon him, but the man had refused. Reynolds couldn't shake the image of him, the man who had fought for a country that had forgotten him, the man who had carried a medal of valor but was treated like a shadow in the streets. The man had suffered beyond what anyone could imagine, but in the end it was clear that he didn't want pity. The homeless man stood up, adjusting his jacket, the cold air of the station biting at his face. Reynolds looked up from his desk, hoping that somehow he had made a difference. But the man's expression was calm, unbothered by anything but his own dignity. "I don't need charity," the homeless man said, his voice steady as he slowly walked toward the door. "I've lived through enough to know that what I need isn't something anyone can give me. What I need, I have to find on my own." There was a quiet strength in his words, a sense of pride that couldn't be taken away, no matter how many times the world tried to break him. "But thank you," he added, his tone softening slightly. "Thank you for finally seeing me for who I really am. Not for who I've become, but for who I was and still am." Reynolds opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, his throat tight. He couldn't apologize enough, couldn't undo what had been done. But he had learned something more important than any lesson he could have ever imagined. The homeless man turned toward the door, his movements slow but sure, each step filled with a quiet resolve. The officer watched him, a strange mix of guilt and respect flooding his heart. There was no hero's exit for this man, no applause, no cheering crowd. He simply walked away, disappearing into the cold night, leaving the officer to reflect on everything he had just witnessed. Reynolds stood up and walked to the window, his hand resting on the cool glass. He watched the man disappear into the distance, his figure blending into the shadows of the street. There was something in the way he walked, in the way he held himself, that stuck with Reynolds long after he was gone. The officer's reflection stared back at him from the glass. He looked different somehow, not because of the uniform or the badge he wore, but because something inside of him had changed. He had been humbled by a man who had nothing left to lose but still carried himself with a dignity that Reynolds could only hope to garrulate. The officer took a deep breath and let it out slowly, his mind heavy with thoughts of change. He wasn't sure how or if he could ever fully make amends for the things he had done. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't go back to being the man he had been before. As he turned away from the window, his eyes caught sight of the small, tarnished medal on the desk, still sitting in the plastic bag. He reached out and picked it up, running his fingers over the worn edges, the symbol of sacrifice now weighing heavily in his hand. Reynolds thought about the homeless man one last time. He thought about how he had walked away with pride, knowing that he had been seen, even if it had been for just a moment. And for the first time, Officer Reynolds understood that seeing someone for who they truly were was the first step in treating them with the respect they deserved. As the door to the station closed behind him, he took a final glance at the spot where the man had stood. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that whatever it was, he would no longer ignore the people around him. He would see them, really see them, and that would be the first step toward changing his own life and maybe, just maybe, the world around him.